Welcome to a special edition of Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I am John Layfield, better known as Bradshaw, joined by my WWE Hall of Fame partner and my good friend, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we have got a treat today. Mr. Nick Groom, Dr. Nick Groom, Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford University, has also been all over for universities from Exeter, Chicago, Stanford, Oxford, Bristol. He is now at Macau University. He is an expert in a lot of things that are very interesting, such as vampires, J.R. Tolkien, Frankenstein, and he is also called the Prof of Goth. We have got a rock star on with us. Nick, Doctor, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Lovely to meet you both.
Doc, let me ask you, the Prof of Goth. How did you get so interested in goth? You've interested in a lot of great things at an incredible time in history, from the Frankenstein writings to Tolkien, later, obviously, but
Sure.
also Shakespeare, you've written on extensively. And of course, Dracula, A New History. Dracula is the book that's out, incredible book. Your take on it is even more incredible. What got you interested in this period of history and goth?
Well, I was very interested in the Gothic when I was doing my doctoral research because I realized that a lot of people date Gothic literature, in other words, supernatural fiction, to the late 18th century. And I realized that, in fact, the Gothic was a form that was very popular long before that. My approach is really to take a long historical perspective. And in fact, people were talking about the Gothic in terms of furniture and architecture and even the Constitution long before it was a literary form. In fact, even before the first Gothic novel was published, commentators were saying, we're sick to death of the Gothic. Can we move on to something else now? That was 1750. And so that's long time before Frankenstein, Dracula, and so forth. So that's really my approach, is to look at the history and take a much longer perspective of the history of the Gothic. And that's, allowed me to write on the Castle of Otranto, Frankenstein, as you say, vampires and Dracula and so forth. And I'm interested also in the contemporary Goth culture today. So I really look at the Goths from the beginning of history and the Roman Empire all the way up to the present day.
How has it changed over the years from where you first saw it, maybe ecclesiastical type structures of considered goth, and that kind of goes into a movement? How has that changed now to what goth is considered today?
Oh, it's changed hugely. It was originally much more political. Now it's a fashion statement. And it changes really every few years, and people don't really know the history. So I'm not suggesting that these things are necessarily connected, but the same word is used. And because the same word is used, you can trace some connections, I think, particularly the deeper you go. But I don't think you have to know about ecclesiastical architecture to be a guitarist in a goth band.
Doc, going back how did you get interested in this the fascinating subject? Was it something happened, or did you just stumble on it, or what piqued your interest in it?
It was through my doctoral research and looking at a number of writers in the late 18th century. And they were interested in national identity and where the English came from. And so they traced the English back to the ancient Goths, which is a bit sort of unlikely, but it was a myth. It was a story about where the country comes from. And that's one of the things that then led me further down this rabbit hole and realized that the Gothic was a very rich and under-researched area. People do, there's a lot written about the Gothic, but about the later Gothic, not about the early history.
The book you have is The Vampire, A New History. But before we get to that, you got to vampires itself. Was goth what took you to vampires? Is that how the progression worked?
Yeah, effectively, John, that's how it worked. But again, with vampires, I was asked to write an essay for a book, and I approached it from the point of view of looking at the early history again. And we'll talk about this perhaps a little bit later on. Most people think that vampires begin maybe in the 19th century, certainly with Dracula at the end of the 19th century. I realize there's a whole earlier history of 100 years that generally tends to get overlooked. And I found that very interesting. So I made the mistake of writing one essay, and since then people keep asking me to do more. So that's where the book came from.
And one of your first things was the Soho vampire. Was that one of the first things am I conflating things, or is that one of the first things that you first wrote about?
No, that's a conflation. No, that's something entirely different. I mean, I was very interested in the vampires of the 18th century. which, as I say, tend to be rather neglected. And I was just hoping to excavate those, really, if not resurrect them.
And you mentioned 1725, I believe it was around that time,
Yeah.
1725, 1730, the first time the word vampire has been mentioned. And you mentioned how it was a political statement as well, but as also a
Yeah.
physical thing as well. Kind of explain that to us, because I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, well, obviously, bloodsuckers have been part of every civilization, every culture, pretty much since the beginning of time. But if you try to write a history of vampires that takes in the whole of world history, you're not really going to get very far. So I wanted to write the history that begins with the first use of the word vampire. As you quite rightly say, that's in the 1720s. And really, what happens is that there are these villages in Eastern Europe that have been very traumatized by the politics of the Ottoman and the Habsburg Empire, in other words, the politics of Turkey and Austria-Hungary. They keep being sort of, they're like sort of political footballs. They keep getting taken over by different countries. And that led to a level of trauma. And that was expressed through these fears of vampires. And there were so many stories about vampire attacks. And officials were sent out. It's a bit like the X-Files. The Habsburg government sent out sort of task forces and sort of SWAT teams to try to deal with these vampires. And they sent out medics and magistrates and people to take sort of witness statements and testimonies to perform autopsies and so forth. And that meant that there was a sort of huge level of belief, and that meant that vampires became a really hot topic of conversation and debate across Europe for many years in the 18th century, long before people write stories about them. They're treated as a, you know, as a fantastical phenomenon. So it takes nearly 100 years for people to write stories, but up until then, they're being debated by natural scientists and by theologians and by philosophers, and people are trying to explain how it's possible. And of course, it then appears even more possible when they discover the blood-sucking bat. People realize that there are bloodsuckers.
And name it the vampire bat.
The name of the vampire bat eventually, yes, yes.
We had a couple of cases though that happened almost right away. So like 1725, you hear the first time you mentioned the word vampire, but Plagowitz and Paul,
Yeah.
two famous two bodies that were exhumed and staked, killed
Yes.
again, all kinds of crazy things about what happened. Where that was just 1732. That was just 7 years later. So some real things were going on, and some real fear was going on about how did it get from we have medical problems to vampires.
Well, we don't know because we know that many people believed in them. And you're quite right that Peter Plagagovich and Arnold Paulé are the two main, the best known cases. They're the ones that were publicized. But there were many, many other cases. The archives are full of these cases. And it was, you know, as I say, it was trauma of villages. It was how to explain the spread of contagious diseases. People didn't know how diseases spread. So suggesting that it was a vampire attack, which was causing outbreaks of, you know, perhaps things like cholera, was a really good explanation. So, you know, doctors, for example, wouldn't know whether diseases were carried by the air. Some of them thought that they were carried by words. So if you listened to somebody who was infected, you would get the disease.
Wow.
Some of them thought that if a patient looked at you, they would infect you. So you better, you know, make sure you blindfold your patients. So vampires in this context seem quite likely. They're sort of, it's the infected dead rising from the earth and infecting their relatives and then their neighbors and their livestock and whole villages. So it's an attempt to try to explain that. At the same time, you have other scientists who are saying, well, it's, you know, people in cataleptic states that, you know, they haven't really died, or the fact that they haven't decayed is down to some chemicals in the soil, or maybe it's because people have unwittingly taken deliriant drugs or hallucinogenic drugs, and they're therefore, you know, imagining that these things are happening. But I think it's very difficult to underestimate the reality of vampires for many people, particularly in Eastern Europe in the early part of the 18th century. And this was one of the things that really confused the authorities and particularly philosophers because there was just too much evidence. If you started to deny, say, well, we don't believe witnesses, well, where does that take you? You're undermining the whole basis of, how we make sense of the world and the legal system and things like that. So
Yeah.
they were in a quandary.
And in these two cases, Plagowicz and Powell, the report was when bodies were exhumed, they staked the heart, fresh blood came out, the
Oh,
body
it did.
groaned.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
blood
there are loads
dripping
of
from the
witnesses who
mouth.
testified to that, that the bodies shrieked, that blood spurted out, that when they opened the coffins were full of blood. So, I mean, how do you explain that? Well, there are ways of saying, well, maybe they were infected with some sort of disease and it's all to do with the decay, the post-mortem decay of the body. But people didn't understand it. And, we don't really understand it. I mean, how many of us have dug up a dead body and investigated it? Not many, I hope.
Yeah, none that will admit it.
Yeah, anyway.
We haven't, but if we had, we certainly would admit it.
And you'd probably be surprised how it reacted. But certainly, these stories were very plausible because you're dealing with a world that's coming to terms with, things like the circulation of the blood. That was only sort of fairly recently been discovered in the previous century. So the whole world is being reimagined. Things like, magnetism. We're moving into a period where people discover oxygen and then sort of things like electricity. These are invisible forces. There are things we completely accept today. We accept there are certain invisible forces and other ones we don't believe in. But at the beginning of that history, people, are being told that there are these things. And so therefore vampires, because vampires are very physical. Vampires need to eat, but they need nutrition. They need blood. So they're not like ghosts. They are physical. They sort of have this, this presence, and you can slay them, as you quite rightly say. You sort of stick a stake through the heart. You're basically nailing them to the ground, so they can't get up again.
Is that the meaning of the stake? You're just nailing
Yeah,
them to the ground. So
yeah, and people have been buried like that for centuries. So yeah, to prevent the dead from getting out their coffins, you nail them to the ground, or you might break their legs. You might you might sort of put
break a
chains
dead
around the
person's
coffin.
legs. Yeah.
Yes. And I mean, there are other things. I mean, obviously, cutting the head off, taking the heart out, ideally cremating the body and throwing it into a river, so that it can't come back. But all these are very physical ways of dealing with it. So it's quite different from
Doc,
ghosts.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Doc, is this a global thing, global folklore, or is it
No,
kind of?
no, this is very specific to Eastern Europe in the early 18th century.
And
Although, as I say,
early United States too, though, right? And,
well, it gets to the US certainly, but that's a little later. In fact, Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, investigated New England vampires.
so it's kind of
1800s.
restricted into the European culture.
It spreads, yeah, but it is seen as an East European phenomenon. So there's later versions. I mean, you do get vampires in the Caribbean, stories about vampires in the Caribbean and so forth,
Right.
as well as many in Britain, France, Germany. But
Well,
those are
they
later
they
versions.
celebrate certain countries in South America. They celebrate the dead like that.
Oh, they do. But I think I'm reluctant to see all vampires or all bloodsuckers as being the same. I just want to concentrate on that European vampire because that's the one that then influences Dracula, and that then becomes the global recognized vampire. The others are bloodsuckers, or they've got various names, different names.
And one thing you mentioned that added to the myth of the vampire is because of politicians. So Karl Marx had used the term bloodsucker,
Oh
politician,
yeah, yeah.
bloodsucker. But so you have on one side legitimate fears of human beings, but you have on the other side people taking the name and using it to their advantage. So that grows the myth of. I thought it was a really unique proposition. Made so much sense the way you wrote it.
Well, the very first report of vampires from Eastern Europe in England, the commentator says this is a political allegory. It's because people in Eastern Europe can't criticize the government, so they have to do it through these images of bloodsuckers and being exploited. And that's something you're quite right. That's something that Karl Marx picks up on, and he uses the imagery quite a lot. It makes you wonder what he was reading at bedtime. I think he was reading vampire stories.
And you
Well,
also mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead, Doc.
well, he talks about grave diggers. He talks about, the bourgeoisie sucking the life out of the proletariat and so forth. He talks about the living dead. So he does use a lot of those, Gothic
Right.
vampire images.
One thing that makes you such a great writer is your reverse Eucharist. I don't know if anybody else would have thought of this. This is please explain because I think that's what's so amazing
Please.
the way you wrote this.
Oh well, yeah, that was that's a bit of a theory that sort of with the Eucharist, you're taking wine, which then transubstantiates or is symbolic, depending on your position within the Christian Church, of the blood of Christ. So it's symbolic nutrition, whereas a vampire takes blood as literal nutrition. So it's not symbolic; it's actually literally consuming the blood. And vampires they were at the time in the 18th century, they're interpreted as being possibly an attack on the Christian Church, whether that's the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic Church. Because the whole idea of staking somebody to the ground is like a version of the crucifixion, except that it's on horizontal ground and it's through the heart rather than on a cross and through the extremities. So it does seem to be a rethinking of some of those Christian elements, I think. And, reading Dracula, it's interesting that they use a lot of science, they use technology, but they also use things like rosary beads and, of course, crucifixes to defend themselves against the Count.
One thing you mentioned is about the first line of Dracula, about the train being late, and it shows that they're at the edge of the empire, when things are not running so smooth. Did it have a lot to do, in your opinion, with the growth of the vampire mythology? Because you had the Enlightenment reaching where the Enlightenment had not been, and that
Oh,
dynamic
yeah, yeah,
causes
yeah.
a lot of things.
I mean, the first thing I'll say is probably the most boring opening sentence of any great novel. Sort of complaining about the trains being late. But the one of the reasons for the way that sort of the vampire stories developed in the 18th century is because it was cutting edge technology and science. It was trying to deal with this folkloric superstition. And vampires since then have always been associated with modern technology. So they're not ancient creatures which are part of some sort of dim and misty sort of superstition. You look at Dracula, it's not just the defenders of light who are using telegraph and Winchester rifles and phonographs and so forth. Dracula himself is really good at import and export. He's a real estate speculator. In fact, Jonathan Harker says that Dracula would make a good solicitor. I don't know who would employ him in that
Right,
capacity,
right.
Yeah.
but
The odd hours you would work.
It'd have to be midnight court, though.
in other words, Dracula vampires tend to be very modern, and you find that when they start getting into literature, they're very much associated with the latest medical science, with things like blood transfusion. They are, seen as contemporary figures. Yeah, there's certainly stories about old and medieval vampires, but the real attraction is they're in our world today. They're part of the contemporary world. And you can see that throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, I think, with many of the great vampire stories, that they are seen as, they're with us now. They're not just sort of ghosts from history.
We've had Dr. Stoker on our show, the grandnephew of
Oh,
Bram,
sure. Yeah.
and it just fantastic person from Canada, now lives down in the Carolinas. But he talked about how his great uncle went through medical technology to
Mm.
write Dracula. Is that what you saw as well?
Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated that Bram Stoker he spent 7 years researching. So he knew all of this early 18th century history. And he knew that there was sort of medical and forensic and legal aspects of vampires. And that's what he gets into his book. And I think he does it really effectively. He also, his brothers were, in fact, medical doctors. So he wrote to one of his brothers and found out what the effects of head trauma would be, so he can actually get the medical details right. So he wanted it to be accurate and realistic in that sense, even though he's writing about a vampire, which is, one of the undead. And I think that that's what sort of attracts people to these stories and later to the films. It's a combination of that reality, the fact that these are, they are physical, living, breathing creatures, but at the same time they have this extra, aspect of both preying on the humans and also having this sort of potential for immortality. Which in the early stories that doesn't really matter so much. So the immortality becomes more important later in the account of vampires. It seems to be very important for people today who watch Twilight.
Right. There's so many things. You mentioned staking, but there's also a drinking of the burned heart ashes, the cremation of heart ashes, put them in water and drink them down. There's poppy seeds they'd spread around because of the
Yeah.
and skull and crossbones they could make out of different things. This sounds so crazy, and it is.
Yeah.
How
Yes.
widespread was this, or is it just a matter of hearing a few stories and taking that and thinking it was huge, widespread, and it wasn't?
Well, again, it's this sort of question of people not understanding what was going on. So as early as the 1730s, you get these stories about, as you say, poppy seeds winding the body in briar roses, and also the use of garlic, which seems to come from left field. But in fact, we now know that garlic purifies the blood. So maybe there was something in that. But you get this mix of folklore and science. And we tend to forget that in the early days of Enlightenment science in the 18th century, the two were much more closely connected. And, science, in some senses, was seen as magic. You talk about, Ben Franklin trying to capture lightning in a bottle. I mean, that's,
Right.
it is magical in a sense. And, the experiments on birds in glass globes when you remove the air and the bird apparently dies and then you put the air back in and it revives. The relationship between science and superstition was much closer. And so people were, quite frankly, if you're being threatened by a vampire, I mean, prepared to try anything.
Yeah, really.
Right.
So,
Right.
and that's what Bram Stoker shows in the novel Dracula. That the defenders of light do, use every, defense, from the polymath Van Helsing, Abraham Van Helsing, who's like sort of professor many times over with dozens of degrees and is very learned. But he's also the one who's giving them all a crucifix and telling them to carry rosary beads and having the holy wafer because he's got a special deal with the Pope and so forth. So it's that sort of mix of science and the intellectual approach, but also the sort of religious superstition.
Does science and folklore kind of at a point meet where they agree on a lot of stuff about the vampires?
Well, they debated it for many years. I mean, the interesting thing is that the church, on the one hand, the Roman Catholic Church thought, well, great, vampires show there's life after death. But on the other hand, it's not the life you really want to lead.
Right.
But it suggested that there was, in other words, there was more to the world, to the physical world. There was actually a metaphysical world. So that's one of the reasons that there are many theologians who write about vampires because they're trying to make sense of them. The real sticking point was how they were able to leave their graves and return to them without disturbing the earth. And they could work out pretty much everything else. It's quite obvious with strangling people and then sort of sucking their blood. Well, that's just very physical, and it leaves certain sort of evidence which is very common. But they couldn't work out how the vampires could leave their graves, and so that became, in a sense, the point where belief began to evaporate and people stopped believing in vampires because that wasn't a physical possibility. However, in the 19th century, you get the people interested in psychic science, astral projection, and theosophy. And they come up with theories saying, well, this is all about, the astral soul being projected from the body, and that's what the vampire is. So there's a renewal of interest. And they get very interested in what they call energy vampires or psychic vampires. And people still talk about those today. These are the people that when you spend any time in their company, you just feel really tired out because they sap your enthusiasm and vitality. And they seem to feed off, your own energy. And so that sort of theory begins in the 19th century, that it's not necessarily blood, it's actually the life force that these vampires are taking. And we all know people like that.
Right. But it got so big that even like people like Voltaire were commenting on it. It was superstition of the ignorant is what he said. So it was
Oh
actually
yeah, yeah.
big enough that you had a lot of people trying to either dispel it or to do something with it.
Yeah, yeah, you had the leading French philosophers, as you say, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau. They were really frustrated. They said, we've been basing all of our, philosophy on, physical evidence and way we can rationalize the world. We've now got thousands of people saying they believe in vampires and providing, apparent evidence. So where does that leave us? So they had to begin to rethink, how much do you trust what other people say? Can it be relied on?
Right.
Are witnesses credible? And you get a sort of a shift really in sort of philosophical thinking because you can't always rely on the accuracy or veracity of those witnesses and their testimonies. But yeah, the fact that it engages Voltaire, I mean, just sort of shows that this was sort of mainstream.
Right.
But again, before it gets into literature, before it becomes the subject of fiction, so it's taken very seriously.
Once it starts getting into literature, a lot has been made about who the Dracula or your main vampire characters were based on. Vlad the Impaler is probably the leading candidate right now for Romania. I lived in Vienna. I never made it down to Romania. I always wanted to go down to his castle. Never did make it. But also Elizabeth Bathory from Hungary, reportedly 650 young women she had killed. Had no idea if any of that, how much of that is true or not. She reportedly bathed in their blood, was what she did. So these two characters seem to be the leading two characters for basing vampires. And surprisingly, when I start reading your research, women were the most vampires when they first started, which makes perfect sense if you've been married as long as me and Mr. Briscoe have. So,
We've known a few of them.
that's right. So, what are
You
your
shouldn't
thoughts
say
on?
that.
What are your thoughts? Oh yeah,
No.
no, yeah. She can't hear me. What are your thoughts about either Elizabeth Bathory or Vlad the Impaler, or who this might have been? The original vampires might have been based on for literature.
Yeah, well, I know that this is a sort of a theory that began in the 1970s, and I must say, although it's very widespread, I'm extremely skeptical of it. The first reason for that is that Bram Stoker does not appear to have been aware of Vlad the Impaler. It's possible that he was told the story of Vlad the Impaler by a friend of his, a Hungarian friend called Armand Vombury, but we've got no real evidence. So Vlad the Impaler was not part of British or even Northern European culture. Although it seems on the face of it, and certainly in films such as the Francis Ford Coppola movie, he makes a very good connection. But in terms of it being an impact on Bram Stoker's Dracula, I don't think so, because until somebody can come up with some evidence that Bram Stoker knew enough about Vlad the Impaler, and until we can find out what more, if there was any more known about Vlad the Impaler in the 19th century, then it seems to be unlikely. I'd also warn any of your viewers not to look up what Vlad the Impaler really did online, because you'll have nightmares if you read
Oh, it's
about it.
horrible, absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
It's just, oh my God, it's sickening how bad
It
it is.
is.
Yeah. In terms of Elizabeth Bathory, that's a little bit more possible because there's a book called The Book of Werewolves by somebody called Sabin Baring-Gould that Bram Stoker certainly read. And Baring-Gould does describe the supposed crimes of Elizabeth Bathory, although he doesn't, I don't think he names her. He talks about a sort of Hungarian aristocrat. Now, in terms of those crimes, it's probable, I think, that they were trumped up charges to discredit her. Because although she was convicted of these, this sort of horrific sort of mass murder of many young children and particularly young girls and bathing in their blood, and she was convicted of it, she only got imprisoned. It's not like she was executed. So it might have been an attempt just to remove her from the political, the sphere of influence from the court. But it's more likely that Bram Stoker, well, he definitely did know about her because she's in the Book of Werewolves, which, as I say, he read. But whether he uses her as a model, I think we need to do more work on it. There's also a poem about her, which was published in the mid 19th century, which I'm hoping to do a little bit more work on. as well about the way that she preys on her servants. But you're quite right that many of the vampires, by the time we get to the 19th century, in vampire tales, are female. And in fact, we've got more female vampires, or she-vampires, we might prefer to call them, in Dracula itself than we have male vampires. We've got this sort of what they call the brides of Dracula, those three seductive women. And we also, have Lucy, who's vampirized herself. So, the she-vampires outnumber the male vampires, and they do in 19th century fiction throughout. That there are many, many more she-vampires. But these days, when we think of a vampire, you tend to think of, an aristocrat, male, quite seductive. That's only one version of the vampire at the time. There are all sorts of different vampires. There are vampires who are, peasants, intellectuals, connoisseurs, or monstrous and very bestial, idiotic, as well as being, involved in the medical world, the scientific world, involved in international trade and slaving and so forth, and also Islamic vampires, as I said, Caribbean vampires. So the actual range of vampire representation before we get to Dracula is very wide. Dracula, in a sense, narrows everything down,
Now,
and we end up with
when
this
I'm sorry.
iconic figure.
Yeah. Now, when you get the European vampires and Caribbean vampires, what are the difference in? Are there much difference in them, or are the folklore still the same?
Um, the So the first vampire story published in Europe is, well, there is a German novel that's been lost, so we don't know what was in that. But it's generally considered to be something called The Vampire, a short story by John Polidori, who was a friend of Byron's. And this was published in 1819. And my argument is it was written in 1819 as well, although other people have different theories. A couple of months later, this another story appears in the US called The Black Vampire. And this is based in Haiti, and it's about an African prince who's also a slave himself, who then goes to San Domingo and interacts with the French plantation owners, in fact, vampirizes them. And the whole story is certainly deliberately based on that European vampire, but it also includes lots of Islamic elements as well. So from Islam, we get the idea of the ghoul, the sort of humanoid creature that sort of lives in a cemetery or graveyard and feeds on sort of human remains. And that's quite a popular aspect of the vampire in the early 19th century in stories such as The Black Vampire. And then it gets revived actually in the US in the middle of the century. And there's another sort of Islamic dimension in a story called What Was It, which is about an invisible vampire in New York City.
You
So
mentioned
there are lots of influences coming in here.
you mentioned John Polidori's book, The Vampire 1819. Your book, The Vampire: A New History, was released 200 years later, released on the same year for the anniversary, from what I read.
That was the publisher's idea, yes.
That's see, you read something on the internet, it's got to be real. That's one of those things. Abraham Lincoln said that if it's on the internet, it's got to be real. I read that on the internet. But why was that book so important?
Well, I think that it's important because it's the first vampire story in English and it's very influential. And the reason why it's influential, though vampires had appeared in lots of, books and sort of treatises and essays and indeed poems, they were only as metaphors. They were only there to talk about people who are bloodsuckers, who are leeches, who exploit in different ways. So they refer to politicians or people dealing on the stock exchange or the corrupt clergy, or even people who review books, apparently. But what Polidori did, he turned the vampire into a character. It was a character who was at the center of a story. So he had an identity. He wasn't just a metaphor. He became, recognizable. And I can sort of compare it with something like with a character like Death. So for many years, death is just seen as this sort of grim reaper, just a force. And then you get a film like The Seventh Seal, and suddenly death becomes a character. And then you get later writers like Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, who then look at the character of death and make death quite sort of, well, interesting and fallible. And sort of death has faults and human characteristics. And that's really what Polidori did with the vampire. He took a stock figure that was recognizable but had no identity and turned it into a character who is charismatic, dangerous, contradictory, untrustworthy. And that was his big contribution. And the book became massive on the stage. It was a huge dramatic success. There were many, many versions in 10 years following its publication on stage in London, in Paris, then across Europe, and then over to New York. So it was that really spread the popularity of this new literary vampire figure. It was more to do with the stage, and then it becomes a recognizable figure and becomes very popular in whole range of writing.
You
Again,
mentioned in your book, A New History, that vampires in some ways are a mirror of society. They reflect things that people don't particularly like evil capitalists, like politicians, and such of that. When you first started with the vampires around 1725 and writings about them, mostly were women. Then that changes. What changed in history that made that change with the vampire novels and the writings?
I think people saw the potential. They began to realize the actual depth that sort of vampires could be used as a way not just of criticizing society at a particular moment, and talking about international trade and the rise of capitalism and saying like Marx says, and that's it. They realize that every time society shifts and it's changing all the time, that the vampire can still be a commentator. I mean, when I started the book, people were saying, "Oh well, the vampires they're going out of fashion, aren't they? Nobody's going to be talking about vampires next when your book comes out next year." It's barely begun. I think they're going to that they sort of have this sort of perennial possibility. They every generation or every year they can be reinvented, they can be reworked because they're about basically about sort of power, exploitation, domination, but also what it is to be human and what does make us human and what sort of prevents us from being vampires. Well, one of the horrible things is that you don't know that you're not a vampire until you're rotting in the grave or ashes in the crematorium. So that's a rather sort of like a dark way of sort of confirming your humanity. But maybe that's the answer. So vampires do force us to face up to mortality as being one of the defining aspects of what makes us human. And it's troubling, it's rather disturbing, but it's something which we're all going to face because, as yet, nobody's lived forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Bram Stoker's book Dracula, when it came out in the late 1890s, was that the kind of the moment that set everything on fire? Because it seems like vampires are catching steam, catching momentum. Then all of a sudden, Bram Stoker catches lightning in a bottle, catches the human wave at the same time with all types of medical things going on that people can't explain. He writes this novel about vampires that are catching wave. Was this the gasoline that was poured on the fire for vampires, the Bram Stoker novel?
Well, that's a really interesting question because that's how we see it today. That it looks like, sort of Bram Stoker, as you say, sort of like poured the gasoline onto the sort of embers. But the vampire had been building up this sort of head of steam throughout the 19th century, and there were many, many stories. Bram Stoker's sort of two great innovations, I think, were first of all to do the research and bring together so many aspects of the vampire. And secondly, to write a full-length novel rather than a short story. There was a serial called Varney the Vampire in the late 1840s. It was a weekly serial, which was then published as this like gigantic and almost unreadable novel. Although you can thankfully still get it today. But Bram Stoker was riding on the crest of a wave. One of his great friends was somebody called Mary Braddon. And just a year or two before Dracula, she published a book called Good Lady Duquesne, which was about this female who lives on. She's incredibly old and she lives through transfusing blood from her female servants without them knowing it. So she has this Italian doctor who, when the servants are sleeping, takes blood from them and injects it into this woman. And when it was first published in the Strand magazine, there's this picture of this sort of really ancient old lady with these two gigantic bat wings behind her. So there's clearly a sort of like a strong sort of vampire association. And she was a friend of Bram Stoker. So it was the vampire was a very popular figure. And in fact, that stage presence remains popular throughout the 19th century. So, Bram Stoker was a man of the theatre. He was a theatre manager and the sort of agent for Henry Irving. So, if you wanted to have a guaranteed hit on the stage, put on another vampire play. And most of them were sort of fairly comic. You could get musicals, you could get farces, even ballets. Some of them satirized contemporary figures, such as Oscar Wilde. He appears in one of the vampire stage plays. But so Bram Stoker's bringing all that together, and then he's putting it into a full-length novel. Now, in the same year that he publishes that, somebody else writes a vampire novel, which is called, Blood on the, I'm getting it mixed up now. It's the Blood of the Vampire. So, in a sense, Bram Stoker's catching the zeitgeist. And it's Florence Marryat's Blood of the Vampire. So the time was just right for a vampire novel, and Bram Stoker gets in there. And one of the things that people like about it, the reviewers say, this is so up to date. They said, we really like its up to datedness. So it wasn't, as I sort of said earlier, some, old nostalgic sort of historical superstitious thing. It was the fact that it was full of cutting edge pioneering technology. And it seemed to be almost looking forward. Because in the same year, you then get the first X-rays. And Bram Stoker makes all these interesting notes. He says, you can't take a photograph of a vampire. If you do, it'll come out looking like blackened bones. I mean, that's really absolutely, on the button for,
Right.
for what, X-rays are. And he also says you can't sort of paint them because you can't capture their identity. So it's interesting. He's thinking about all these different areas. And as I said, doing the research. He puts a lot of work into that novel. It's a shame he didn't put the same amount into anything else.
A tremendous amount of work, it seems like. And out of all the publications, all the literature out there, is there a certain book that you would advise some of our listeners, if they get interested in this subject, to kind of read to get the real?
Yeah, I mentioned it already, the Book of Werewolves by Sabin Baring Gold, which is available. You can get it today. It's supposed to be an academic book about the history of werewolves. It's the first history of werewolves written in English. In fact, it reads more like a sensational novel because everything is over dramatized. So there's no sense of sort of scholarly restraint. So he really enjoys his subject.
Yeah,
And this is a clergyman. He was a polymath clergyman,
is it?
and he just sort of loved writing about this stuff. And he also collected legends, folk stories, folk songs, and things like that. And he also wrote his own story about a vampire on Dartmoor in Devon, England, which was a female vampire again. But that's a vampire story that is about the legal status of vampires and whether vampires can own property and whether they can marry. And when Dracula was published, it was compared to that very story, to Marjorie of Quether. So that was definitely, well known at the time. So what I'm saying is that, Dracula is part of this sort of like tide of vampire fiction. And a bit like a sort of surfboard, and Bram Stoker gets to the crest of the wave and rides it, and continues to do so.
In your book, in your book,
What?
in history,
Okay, go ahead,
you
John.
talk about how vampires are, they're kind of a mirror of society, but they also fill a void in society that society needs, and that's why vampires will always be around because society always needs that. What has been the greatest evolution that you've seen of the vampire from 1725, the first listing, to Bram Stoker, to Polidori, to your book, to today, to the young blood, and to all the different things that's going on with vampires?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing is that they've become very nice. And they've been called sparkly vampires. You get these green vampires who live on blood from blood banks or blood substitutes. So they've become much less predatory, and they've become ways of thinking about as a, what makes us human? What is it about humans that distinguishes us from other creatures? And that's been the biggest change. There's not much sympathy for vampires or different sorts of vampires earlier than I think sort of about sort of the 1980s, and then you begin to get a sense that we could do even more with this figure. One of my favorite movies is The Hunger, which is this is a Sarah Sarandon movie, and it's also got David Bowie in it as a vampire, and that combines elements of popular culture, such as the goth music culture we were talking about earlier, but also with a way of rethinking vampires. Again, she vampires. It's the female vampires that are in control, but it seems to be looking forward to thinking about blood diseases, particularly HIV at the time, because it was a 1980s movie. So it's suddenly addressing these very, topical issues, and they are sympathetic in that. And then that sympathy grows. The sympathy for the vampire grows through work such as like Twilight, and True Blood, and also in sort of comedy shows such as What We Do in the Shadows, which I think is fantastic. And if your viewers haven't watched that, they should certainly do so.
What is our most recent experience with a vampire? Or has it been any in the modern times, or what?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jerry, because the vampires, I mean, the vampires now become like an international global property because with the spread of the cinema and mass media, every country has got access to the idea of the European vampire through Dracula. But it is used to really give a voice to many contemporary anxieties. So, for example, in certain parts of Africa, there have been fears of vampire outbreaks, which has been villages believing that their blood is being taken by white doctors to sell to rich patients in the West. And it's a sort of fear of medicine, it's a fear of Western medicine, but it's, expressed through this, sort of these vampire stories. So those things definitely do continue. And they are quite recognizably traditional in the sense that they're very similar to many of the concerns in the 18th and 19th centuries, is that, how do you give some sort of expression to your anxiety, to your concern, to your fear? And it's through this sort of supernatural figure, which is just that little bit more powerful than you are.
Around 2020, before COVID, I was down in Malawi helping build a
Oh, right.
school and a sports facility in Area 45, just north of the Longway. And I didn't meet a vampire, but I did get a witch doctor that came out that blessed our facility, which was very nice that he did that. But right before that, 2017, they did have a vampire outbreak where
Wow. Well, there you go.
vigilantes actually pulled people over and killed 8 to 10 different people claiming they
Yeah.
were vampires. Now
Yeah.
they may
Yeah.
have just done it because they wanted to kill them anyway, and they were able to put it on vampires. But vampires are still getting a bad name. I mean, it's
Oh, they are. They are. And I mean, a lot of the rhetoric around COVID, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, was very, very similar to the ways in which diseases were being described in the 18th and 19th centuries because it wasn't known, how it could be combated. And so you see the same sort of amplification or the same escalation. And the virus, the virus in some medical journals was described as a vampire that was, it was a new predator. And that got into the popular press as well. So yeah, it's still with us, and it will remain with us. I don't think I see no evidence that it's going anywhere. We're stuck with it.
there are things like the New Orleans Vampire Association, Nova, that get together, and they're practicing vampires. They don't do anything illegal or go out and suck any blood of non-consensual blood is what they say. So I'm not sure how that works, but that's what they say. What are your thoughts about things like that people just do they? It's just a matter. So I guess it's just a matter of belonging. People want to belong to something. Is that your take?
Yeah, it's a lifestyle choice. There are certainly people who call themselves sanguinarians who say that they can't live without blood. But it's such a small number that it's sort of scientifically impossible to assess. I mean, I will say that I have drunk blood and I wouldn't do it again. It's really salty. It's really what we call an emetic. It'll make you sick.
Now you got to
Um,
tell us more about this. What was the
Yeah,
story?
that's true. You got to tell
You
us the
just
drink blood
can't
story.
pass that by. Drink
We
blood.
got to hear this
Oh,
one.
let's go on.
That's right.
Yeah.
well, these videos are on YouTube. I work with a theatre group called Dr. Dracula, and we had a serious intention with this, which was to encourage people to get their blood tested, to give blood and to get tested for things like hemochromatosis, which is a condition of the blood, which in fact coincidentally was what my grandmother died of. So I sort of had an investment in this. But we decided to do it through vampire stories and get people to think about vampires. And, blood is a really magical thing. The epidemiology of blood. I mean, one drop of blood can tell an expert, exactly your lifestyle and also your life expectancy. So, our whole personal history is in blood, and it's been treated as an almost magical substance for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. So it's we've all got blood. But it's very rare to see blood in a public place unless there's been an accident. So it's a taboo, as well as being,
Right.
it's absolutely necessarily the juice of life, as Piero Camporese describes it. So that sort of making people aware of blood and the importance of things like blood donoring and looking after your blood and your general health seem to be a good way into that. So we did 4 videos as part of this to
And
the
they're
public
awesome,
after the
by the way.
show.
I love them. I watched every
Um,
one of them. There's one of you bathing in blood. There's one of you showing vampire fighting tools with the cross and the stake.
yes.
It's.
But
I love them. They're excellent. I recommend everybody go watch these things.
certainly one of them I did drink as a little bit of blood, and I wish I hadn't done it.
You wish you had.
Wish I hadn't. But it had to be done really, and it was wanted to make the thing authentic. I will say that the bath of blood wasn't real blood. We didn't get that amount of blood, and it was so cold when we filmed that. It was in the winter. It was unbelievably cold, and they said just get in the bath of blood. So you
So,
sure?
so Doc, these days when you walk around and you're walking now, maybe not in Macau. I don't know. Maybe Macau also, but you're walking around in the UK and England. Do like young kids that are all goth dressed up see you and say, "Oh my God, there's the Prof of Goth."
Well, funnily enough, not so much in the UK because I tend to stay in. But I went to a great festival, a convention in Poland called the Perkon Festival, which is so it's a fantasy and science fiction convention, and yeah, they certainly knew me there. I was in fact talking about
That's got to be awesome, though. I mean, you got this incredible name for yourself of this literary moment of time that you feel very passionate about.
well, it wasn't me that came up with the name. It was in fact a singer-songwriter. She's an amazing dark folk goth singer called Jordan Rain. She's from New Zealand, and it was her idea to call me the Prof of Goth in a social media post, and I thought, well,
Are
why
you
not?
are
Nobody
you
else has
are
taken
you
it.
like one of these icons in the goth society? I mean, are you well known in that society?
I'm a member of the.
Are you a part of that society?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I still bear the scars of being a sort of like a goth in terms of
You're like
music.
you're like the OG goth. I mean, you're like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Godfather
you're the
goth.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
They
I
got to
will
pay
say,
they got to pay homage to you.
You got to.
well, I mean, a lot of this is online, but no, I mean, I do respect the goth community, and I think that it's got amazing longevity. Of all those what were considered to be youth subcultures.
Right.
Where are Teddy Boys? Where are mods? They've all gone, but sort of everyone looks. The great thing about being a goth is you can still look cool when you're old. It doesn't matter if you've got long white hair; it actually adds to your style.
You mentioned
It works.
Gothic architect in the beginning. My son's an architect, and that was one of his main primary studies was Gothic architecture. And he loved the study of it.
What's interesting about why it's called Gothic architecture was to link it to those Goths who sacked the Roman Empire. So this was saying this is not classical architecture. It's associated with those people who were anti-classical. And it was partly called Gothic as a term of abuse. But as with many of these things, you call somebody something, you insult them with a name, like you call them an impressionist artist.
right.
because they're not a real artist, and then they take on the name and it becomes a whole movement. So yeah, I mean, I think Gothic architecture is absolutely beautiful, and there's some of the most stunning uh, works of art involving thousands of people and often hundreds of years are those sort of Gothic cathedrals. And I think things like that should rightly be celebrated. And it's part of this sort of rich culture. And it's interesting, of course, in the novel Dracula, Dracula lands in Whitby, the ruined Abbey of Whitby, which is one of these Gothic buildings when he first arrives in England. So Bram Stoker weaves that into the story as well. He wants to get those sort of Gothic ruins as part of the backdrop. But also, there are lovely things like the film Nosferatu by Murnau, the German expressionist film. There's one scene where Nosferatu is coming through a doorway, and it's a pointed arched doorway. So it's like he's the vampire, and he's sort of framed by this coffin-like doorway. And it just reminds you of that architecture, I think. So it's more than a backdrop; it's part of the story, I think.
Right.
Doc, you've written about so much extensively about a wonderful period of history, one of the great periods of history. Sometimes you go through periods of history of centuries of nothing happening, and then all of a sudden you have something like the Enlightenment happen, and all of a sudden the whole world changes. I think we're going through that and now with the internet and AI, and we went through that in the 1900s with the car and the railroad. Before that,
Mm.
the Enlightenment, the part that you've written so extensively about from Shakespeare to what you've written about Goth to what you've written about vampires to all the different things you've written about that era. What's your biggest takeaway from that era and all the stuff that you've written about?
Oh, wow, what a difficult question. My biggest takeaway. There's still so much work to be done. It's a really rich period. And I think it can teach us a lot about what we're facing today. We're going through a period of change now that's so fast and so accelerated in terms of things like AI, which is moving at sort of almost unimaginable rates. But at the same time, a novel such as Frankenstein can tell us a lot about AI and how AI can function, how you can you know create or possibly not create an independent sort of thinking being. And so I think that there's still a lot to learn. And the great thing about literature and art and history is, as people say, it's news that stays news. It doesn't go out of date. And you can go back to these great novels and great films, and you can find new things in them that speak to us today because they have a certain sort of depth, a sort of a validity because they are works that are ultimately about us as humans. And I find that very powerful, really. I mean, that's the biggest takeaway. It has reaffirmed my faith in culture. Our culture is
That's
under
good.
attack in different ways, but I still think that we need to teach literature, we need to teach film, we need to teach people, as Jerry was saying, architecture. That these and we must stay in a close relationship with our history. We need to know where we've come from, and that will help us understand where we're going.
And is there anything particular right now that you're working on that you're excited about getting out or that you want to work on?
Well, I've just published is by Penguin Books. It's just a little edition, but it's a lovely, beautifully printed an edition of Polidori's The Vampire and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. So that's just two vampire stories. In September of next year, I have a big anthology of 19th century vampire stories being published. So if you're interested in those Caribbean, Islamic, and sort of intellectual vampires, all those are in that. So this is a lot of vampire stories before Dracula. But I've also got other interests as well. You mentioned Tolkien, and I'm writing a book about Saints' Days. I'm interested in how we celebrate the year. So how did St. Patrick's Day become, an international celebration, for example? So it's trying to again connect people with history, but in a different way this time, in terms of how we come together as a community and drink Guinness.
That's right. The main thing is
I
drink
like
Guinness at the end. No matter what happens, drink Guinness at the end.
I like
That's the big part. And Doc, how can people find out all of your work and the things that you're doing? How they get hold of you? Or maybe you may not want people to get hold of you, so maybe not.
No,
But
I'm
how
always
do they
happy.
find your website and stuff like that? In case I missed it.
Yes, the University of Macau has a website that's got. I mean, it's not completely up to date because that's my fault, but it's got recent publications on it. It's got my email address, so if people want to get in touch, please do. Depending on how many people do, it may take me a while
Yeah.
to respond, but I think it's really important to have that connection. I mean, for example, yesterday I gave an interview for a student who's writing about patriotism, and he said, "Oh, do you mind talking?" I said, "No, no, of course not. I want to be approachable. So if people want to connect with me, connect."
There you go.
Doc, thank you so much. We've
you.
taken a ton of your time, but it's been such a pleasure to. It's been it's been a wonderful pleasure talking to you, but it's been also a wonderful pleasure researching you the last few days.
Yeah, we started talking a couple of weeks ago how much fun this is going to be, and you lived up to all of our expectations, Doc. We really appreciate it.
But it's been a terrific chat. I really, it's nice to talk to people who are so well informed, so enthusiastic, and it's been a privilege to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.